How many resources would you expend to capture or kill one single man? Think Osama bin Laden, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. Or go back further to Pancho Villa, Blackbeard. Or maybe to the days of Caesar's youth when Crassus hunted down Spartacus and Pompey hunted down Sertorius. Well, in this episode, we're going to get a little window on how Caesar himself deals with this issue in the hunt for Ambiorix. I'm Alex Petkus, and you are listening to The Cost of Glory, where it is our mission to retell the lives of the greatest ancient leaders, the noble Greeks and Romans. This is part 6 of 8 of our series of highlights from Caesar's Gallic War campaigns. And big thanks to Dr. Richard Johnson of the great city of New York for sponsoring this episode and this whole series. Now, some of my favorite passages of this whole work are in this particular book. We're going to get deeper into who these Gauls are and how they think, and the Germans too. But first, we need to deal with the basic narrative arc of the book. Because there are a lot of tribes and names, and it can be pretty confusing. In this episode in particular, it's kind of hard to see the forest for the trees, but the basic arc of the book is, as I alluded to at the beginning, the hunt for Ambiorix. Alex, who's Ambiorix again? Yes, glad you asked. Ambiorix is the man responsible for engineering that incredible disaster that befell the Romans in the last episode, when, under the leadership of the ill-fated Quintus Titurius Sabinus, Ambiorix, you may recall, he tricked the Roman commander, Sabinus, into leaving his camp in haste out of fear of a great uprising, and Caesar thereby lost an entire legion and a half in the ambush that followed. Ambiorix was a leader of the tribe of the eburones, and once again, this is a people who fall under the wider category of Belgae, so they're a Belgian Gallic tribe, and as one listener's pointed out kindly, Ambiorix was actually resurrected as a kind of folk hero beginning in the 19th century by Belgian nationalists. He's a great symbol of resistance to the Romans. There are numerous statues and paraphernalia. He was in Belgian school textbooks. It's very interesting. It's worth looking up. All that hype right there, the national hero hype, in a sense, it gives you a hint about Caesar's motivation in this sequence of events that we're about to get to in a sec. But before we get there, there's a little foretaste in the book, a tiny hint of the great looming political drama that's soon going to unfold at Rome. So Caesar opens the chapter by saying, "For many reasons, Caesar expected a larger uprising in Gaul, so he decided to charge his legates, so-and-so and so-and-so," he names them, "with the task of levying troops." And, considering the disturbances and losses of the previous season, I think that's pretty understandable, recruiting more troops. But then he goes on and he gives us this little fact. Quote, "At the same time, he made a request of Gnaeus Pompey the Great, that, seeing as how Pompey, though a proconsul, was currently remaining near Rome in the interests of the Republic, Pompey send the recruits from Cisalpine Gaul whom he had sworn in when he was consul, now to Caesar to assemble and report to his headquarters in Gaul." End quote. So Caesar here is asking for an extra legion from Pompey, and he explains his reasoning in the text here, and you can be sure that Pompey heard this whole line of argument as well. Quote, "Caesar judged it to be of great importance for the future as well as for the present to create an impression in Gaul that the resources of Italy were extensive enough not only to replenish in a short time any damage incurred during the war, but even to increase the total." So you could say Caesar here wants to do a classic Roman shock and awe recruitment, or maybe you could call it the Hydra method, where, if your enemy cuts off one head, you grow several more to replace it. This is how the Romans defeated Hannibal and the Carthaginians, for example. But with this troop request to Pompey, a little bit more info about the political situation will help you appreciate the stakes here for Caesar. So it's the year 53 now. Pompey, the conqueror, he's the most important man in Rome. This is especially so with Crassus, the great financier, off on a campaign against Parthia in the east, and with his son Publius. And on top of Crassus being gone, the city of Rome itself is going through a period of acute lawlessness. There are mobs led by Clodius and Milo running the streets. The year of 53 began without consuls who were supposed to be sworn in on January 1st and elected several months before, and they haven't even been elected yet. There's a massive bribery scandal around the consular elections. I mean, it's a total mess in domestic politics. We've discussed all of this in the life of Crassus, and especially in the life of Pompey. Pompey, however, has been given a sweeping, extraordinary command as Rome's grain commissioner, which sounds conveniently benign and bureaucratic, but it's actually an incredibly powerful bundle of authorities involving the ability to raise troops and spend unlimited funds and do whatever is necessary to keep the wheat ships rolling into the port of Rome at Ostia. And this office also gives him the authority to flood Rome with troops and crack down and reestablish peace in the place of mob rule, which he's now busy doing in Rome. And Caesar, of course, knows every detail of all of this from his intel team, and he's scrambling to find a way now to renew his alliance with Rome's greatest citizen, Pompey. Recall that Caesar's daughter, that is, Pompey's late wife, Julia's just tragically passed away in childbirth in the previous year, so that tie no longer binds Caesar to Rome's greatest citizen. And Caesar, he doesn't tell us this in his war commentaries for obvious professional reasons, but we do know this from other sources. He, meanwhile, offers to marry Pompey's daughter, and Pompey declines. Then Caesar offers Pompey the hand of his niece, Octavia, but Pompey declines again. So Caesar now is trying the old Ben Franklin technique of just asking a favor of Pompey to soften him up, a token of friendship, in the interests, of course, of the Republic and the people of Rome. You know, he's hoping to bind Pompey somehow to himself. And that token is this legion that we've just mentioned that Pompey enlisted when he was consul in 55, and now he's kind of hasn't done anything with them as grain commissioner. So these are fresh recruits, men in Italy. They've not yet been mobilized properly or gotten properly trained. And to all appearances, this works. At least, Pompey concedes to this request, and he sends Caesar the troops, both as a duty to the state and as a favor to their friendship, as Caesar glowingly remarks. This gesture was going to have major ramifications later on, but we'll discuss that somewhere else. But now, with this legion, combined with 2 other legions that his own guys have raised, Caesar now has 3 new legions, which he notes is twice the number of troops who were massacred under the aforementioned disaster with Sabinus. There's the Hydra strategy of Rome in action. All right, now here's the problem that Caesar needs these fresh new troops to help him face. We began and ended the last episode with a disgruntled noble leader of the Belgic tribe of the Treveri. The guy was a man named Indutiomarus. Indutiomarus was finally killed by Caesar's legate, Labienus, at the end of the last book. And here's Caesar now. Quote, after Indutiomarus was slain, as we have narrated previously, the Treveri conferred the chief command on his relatives, who were continuing to tempt the neighboring Germans and to promise money. As they could not prevail on their immediate neighbors, they tried to persuade those more distant. And having found some states to be willing, they took an oath to confirm their engagement and hostages to secure the money, and they associated Ambiorix with themselves by a league and covenant. End quote. So the Treveri haven't given up the rebellious spirit that Indutiomarus ignited in them. The Treveri, again, are a powerful Belgic tribe near the Rhine who have been on and off allies of Caesar. They were allies in Book 2, but they're currently off ally mode. And now they are bringing in this other Belgian leader that we just met last episode, that we just mentioned, the dashing and successful Ambiorix, slayer of Sabinus and the Legion and a Half. So in other words, Ambiorix has become a sort of lightning rod for Gallic discontent, in particular Belgian discontent. Of course, the Belgians are closer to the Germans, they're tougher, they claim to be descended from the Germans, and so on and so on. So the situation here seems to be escalating. And Caesar goes on, he lists a bunch of names, including the old Nervii, etc. And he's heard, though, that Ambiorix has been having serious talks with the Menapii, who live in this densely forested, swampy region of what's now modern Belgium, near the sea, around where Bruges and Ghent are today. Caesar takes preemptive action. He troop surges into the lowlands, he burns and captures, and pretty quickly the Menapii surrender, and Caesar makes them swear that they will receive neither Ambiorix nor his emissaries into their territory, and if they should dare to do so, they affirm Caesar is completely justified in treating them as enemies. And so, Caesar's gradually depriving Ambiorix and the rebels of any safe ground to lay their head, and he's tightening the net. Meanwhile, while Caesar is busy with this stuff, the scene pans to trusty old Titus Labienus, Caesar's most talented legate. And reading the Gallic war commentaries, one of the things that I find striking is how good Caesar is at telling other people's stories to make them appear in exactly the way that he wants them to appear. You just get such a strong sense of personality from so many of these people. Labienus, on the other hand, is the Roman that Caesar gives by far the most airtime to in these war commentaries, besides himself. And yet, Labienus somehow seems inscrutable still. This is a very efficient, very deadly, and very crafty man that we're dealing with. And you wonder if Caesar felt like he had to keep making Labienus look good, to make sure he stuck around, getting honors from Caesar in the commentaries and the war reports, that he didn't get distracted with, say, a political career. They're going to have a long history together, Caesar and Labienus, and Caesar's going to support his friend's bid for the consulship, which sadly fails. I've already mentioned, though, that Labienus ends up turning against Caesar in the Civil War, and it must have been painful because you can tell Caesar invested so much in this man. And I really think that Caesar enjoyed telling these stories of all of his subordinates' exploits, but Labienus's in particular, because Labienus was by far the commander most likely to do what Caesar would have done in any given situation. So anyway, let's give you the quick highlights of this engagement here. So Labienus is camped near the territory of the Treveri, and the Treveri decide to make a move. And they march with an army within 15 miles of Labienus's camp. Labienus responds by taking 25 cohorts, so that's 2.5 legions, 12,500 men. And he marches up and he camps 1.5 miles from the Treveri, but there's a river between them. And of course he camps on a hilltop. Where else would a smart Roman camp, right? And Labienus is pretty sure, though, that the Treveri are not going to be so foolish as to cross the river and storm his camp, his superior position, unprovoked. But he's also getting reports that the hostile Germans across the Rhine nearby are getting closer and closer to crossing over with a big force. And he knows the Treveri are also getting excited because they're the ones who invited these German allies. So he wants to try to provoke the Treveri to attack him on unfavorable ground, crossing the river, then climbing up the hill before the Germans get there. And so here's what he does. Quote, Labienus declared openly in a council of war that as the Germans were said to be approaching, he would not risk his own and his army's fortunes, and that he would strike camp at dawn next day. This information was speedily carried to the enemy, for he had a large number of Gallic horsemen in his camp, and natural feeling would compel some, so he thought, being Gauls as they were, to favor the Gallic cause. So let that be a lesson. Having spies and informants embedded in your enemy's organization Well, that can play both ways if the enemy figures out what's going on here. Quote, "At nightfall, Labienus summoned the military tribunes and the senior centurions and propounded his plan." So, earlier he was saying publicly, we have to get out of here. It's too dangerous. That's the message he's circulating, and the Gauls take that to the other Gallic camp. But he's sharing his secret instructions now, his real plan with his closest officers going on here. And the more easily to give the enemy a suspicion that he was afraid, he ordered the camp to be struck, shut down, with greater noise and disorder than was customary among the Romans. By this means he made his departure seem like a rout. The camps were so close that this too was reported to the enemy by scouts before daybreak. End quote. So sure enough, the Gauls take the bait, and the next morning, scarcely has the last soldier of Labienus's army left the camp when the Treveri cross the river in haste and attack the Romans, thinking that they're going to be attacking demoralized, fleeing men. And here now is the moment when they realize they thought it was one way, but it's the other way. Quote, "Labienus sent the baggage animals ahead a little and had his soldiers halt on a rise of ground and said to them, 'Soldiers, here is the chance you were looking for. You have the enemy on ground that hampers and handicaps them.' And here it is. 'Now demonstrate the same valor under our command that you have often displayed before the commander-in-chief.'" He means Caesar, of course. "And imagine that he is present and beholds this battle right before his very eyes." Then Labienus immediately ordered the standards to be turned around to face the enemy and the lines to deploy into battle formation. End quote. I just want to note how Caesar really profoundly believes in the power of the gaze of the general. It's almost like a talismanic force, such that simply imagining that it's there can have an effect on morale. I really think Caesar does believe this. Well, the Romans let out a big shout. They hurl their javelins. They charge. The Treveri are completely surprised and overwhelmed. A great Roman victory ensues. And the Germans, who are across the Rhine getting ready to come over, they hear about the great defeat, and they decide to just retire to their homes and villages. Another job well done. Let's hear it for Titus Labienus. But if you're Caesar, well, what are you thinking now? Well, you can bet Labienus knows what he's thinking. Obviously, the Germans' shock and awe from Caesar's last bridging of the Rhine a few years ago has now worn off, and these guys have gotten cocky. They're talking about helping the Treveri against the Romans. How quickly these fickle natives forget the power of Rome. So Caesar's got to cross the Rhine again. But Caesar's also got another plausible reason motivating him. He says he doesn't want to give Ambiorix the possibility of taking refuge among the Germans. So, once again, Caesar builds a bridge and crosses. And he's camped out right there around modern Koblenz, kind of close to where he crossed before. And mainly, at this point, he's just getting embassies from the local tribes. In particular, the Ubii, who are saying, "Oh, we don't want any trouble, Mr. Caesar. No Ambiorix is here. Not now. Not ever." Very good, very good. And the Ubii report that those troops that were mustering to help the Treveri back against Labienus, well, those weren't their guys, but rather some detachments from the much more formidable German tribe, the Suebi. And here are the reports that the Ubii bring back about the Suebi. The Suebi, they said, after more definite accounts of the Roman army came to them, had all withdrawn with all the forces of their own folk and of their allies which they had collected to the uttermost parts of their territory. There was, they added, a forest there of immense size called Bacenus. It extended a long way into the country and interposed as a natural wall to keep the Cherusci from raids and outrages on the part of the Suebi, and the Suebi likewise from the Cherusci. At the edge of the forest, the Suebi had determined to await the coming of the Romans. End quote. And it's not really agreed upon by scholars where exactly the Bacenus forest is, but that area on the east bank of the Rhine has some pretty well-forested hills, even to this day. So I'm going to spoil it here to make a point. So Caesar has spent all this time stoking our curiosity about the Germans, but he's not actually going to end up doing much campaigning on this side of the Rhine, after all. Instead, what he's going to do is treat us to this really fascinating ethnographic digression, comparing and contrasting the Gauls and the Germans. It's a nice technique, masking a kind of abortive campaign with some great entertainment that is not just fluff, but I think it sheds light on the grander narrative of the war. Quality storytelling, once again, by the master. Let's take a look. So he begins with an interesting fact that he's observed about the Gallic political sociology. Quote, "At this point in the narrative, it seems appropriate to set forth the customs of Gaul and of Germany and the difference between these nations." And again, so he's going to start with a long section on the Gauls that we'll make selections of, and then the Germans come after. All right, so going on here. In Gaul, not only in every state and in every canton and district, but almost in every single household, there are parties. And the leaders of the parties, he's talking about factions here, the leaders of the parties are men who in the judgment of their fellows are deemed to have the highest authority, men to whose decision and judgment all disputes and plans may be referred. And this seems to have been in effect from very ancient times, with the idea being that no common citizen should lack assistance against a more powerful neighbor. Each man refuses to allow his own folk to be oppressed and defrauded, since otherwise he has no authority among them. The same principle holds in regard to Gaul as a whole, taken together, for all the nations are divided among two factions. End quote. So, in Gallic society, he's saying, the whole thing is polarized into opposing factions at every level in a kind of fractal way. And note he's suggesting here that the division is not really ideological, but rather practical. Everyone needs a patron if they get bullied. Now he gives an example here, coming up, of how we've seen this polarization play out already in this war. Quote, "When Caesar arrived in Gaul, the leaders of one party were the Aedui, of the other, the Sequani. The Sequani had been weaker, as far as their own resources were concerned, since the highest authority from ancient times rested with the Aedui, and they had a large number of dependents." When he says dependents, he's talking here about other Gallic tribes. And so the Sequani, to counteract the influence of the Aedui, they had made Ariovistus and the Germans their friends, and with great sacrifices and promises, they had brought them in to their side. This was the story that we covered in Book 1. Then, by several successful engagements and the slaughter of all the Aeduan nobility, they had so far established their predominance as to transfer the great part of the dependents, these subordinate tribes, from the Aedui to themselves, receiving the children of their men as hostages, compelling them as a state to swear that they would initiate no plans against the Sequani. And so I'll summarize here, but Caesar goes on and he explains that by means of his own coming, he had reversed the situation. And now it was the Aedui who were back in first place among the Gallic tribes. And I think this lets you go back and reread the whole arc of Book 1 with new eyes. The war against Ariovistus and the Germans, what that one poet, Varro of Atax, that we mentioned at the end, he tellingly called not the war with Ariovistus, but the war with the Sequani, the Bellum Sequanicum. The real purpose of all that maneuvering was for Caesar to pick one faction that happened to be the weaker one at the time, and not for very long. They had a history of being a strong faction, so, he knew they were a good bet. So he picks the weaker one and then he strengthens them, the Aedui that is, and thereby makes them loyal to Rome by their dependency on Caesar and his good graces. This is classic Roman strategy. You pick an underdog, you make him an overdog, and then he's your dog for life. So you hope. And this dynamic, mind you, is not necessarily obvious from reading Book 1. But Caesar more or less admits here that that's what he was doing. Fascinating. All right, we're going to skip ahead here to a famous passage, and he's going to talk about the Druids in a second here. Throughout Gaul, there are only two classes of men who enjoy any kind of distinction and honor. He means the Druids and the Knights, as we'll see in a second. As for the common folk, however, they are treated almost as slaves. They dare not take any independent action of themselves, and they are never taken into counsel. So now you know why Caesar is very suspicious whenever he hears a Gallic leader saying, "Oh, the common folk forced us to do such and such." They don't actually consult the commons at all. Unlike the Romans, notably, or at least unlike Roman populists like Caesar. Okay, going on here. Quote, "The majority of them, the poor that is, oppressed as they are either by debt or by the heavy weight of tribute or by the wrongdoing of the more powerful men, commit themselves in slavery to the nobles, who have in fact the same rights over them as masters over slaves." Going on. "Of the two noble classes mentioned above, one consists of Druids, the other of Knights." Equites in Latin is the Knights. These are the auxiliary Gallic cavalry, right, that Caesar's always using in these campaigns, the Knight class. "The Druids are concerned with divine worship, the due performances of sacrifices, public and private, and the interpretation of ritual questions." So in other words, these are the priestly class of the Gauls. Now this is interesting. Quote, "A great number of young men gather around them for the sake of instruction and hold them in great honor." What, you say? The young men of Gaul follow the priestly types around? But shouldn't the Nietzschean barbarian youth stand in eternal opposition to the priestly forces of ressentiment? But Caesar explains why this is, that the youths do this. Quote, "In fact, it is the Druids who decide in almost all disputes, public and private. And if any crime has been committed or murder done, or there is any dispute about succession or boundaries, they also decide it, determining rewards and penalties. If any person or people does not abide by their decision, they ban such a man from sacrifice, which is their heaviest penalty." It's kind of like their excommunication. And here's what that looks like if it happens to you. Quote, "Those that are so banned are reckoned as impious and criminal. All men move out of their path and shun their approach and conversation, for fear that they may get some harm from contact with them. And they have no recourse to justice even if they seek it, nor do they have any share in public office or honors." So these Druids have real power. They practice ritual cancellation. It's like social death. Now there's a Druid hierarchy too, and this is fascinating. Quote, "Of all these Druids, one is chief, who has the highest authority among them. At his death, the Druid who has the highest standing among those remaining succeeds him, or if there be several of equal standing, they strive for the primacy by the vote of the Druids, or sometimes even with armed force." Imagine what that was like, sacred wars of the Druids. "These Druids at a certain time of year meet within the borders of the Carnutes, whose territory is reckoned as the center of all Gaul, and sit in conclave in a consecrated spot." End quote. And the city of Chartres, by the way, Chartres, is in the territory of the Carnutes. That's where the word Chartres comes from, Carnutes. That continued to be an important religious center through the Middle Ages. There's a famous Gothic cathedral of Chartres there. Makes you wonder what's under it, kind of. "To there," he says, "to the territory of the Carnutes, all assemble from every part who have disputes." All of the Gauls, he means. "And they obey the decisions and judgments of the Druids. It is believed that their rule of life was discovered in Britain and transferred thence to Gaul. And today, those who would study the subject more accurately journey, as a rule, to Britain to learn it. So that's an ongoing cultural connection between Gaul and Britain. It's like the center of sacred Druidic studies. Stonehenge is already there, right, by this time. Going on here, the Druids do not usually participate in war. They do not pay war taxes with the rest. They are excused from military service and exempt from all liabilities. Diviciacus of the Idui, who we met in Book 1, the chief Druid, he was apparently an exception. He did participate in war. Tempted by these great rewards, many young men assemble of their own accord to receive their training as Druids. Many are sent by parents and relatives. Report says that in the schools of the Druids they learn by heart a great number of verses, and therefore some persons remain 20 years under training, and they do not think it proper to commit these utterances to writing, although in almost all other matters and in their public and private accounts they make use of Greek letters." End quote. And many Gallic language writings have been found using the Greek alphabet. So this intense memorization culture reminds you of the Vedic priests of India, maybe the epic bards of archaic Greece like Homer, although those latter guys are not very closely linked with like the religious cult. But why do they do this? Why do the Druids do this, Caesar wonders? Well, he says, quote, "I believe that they have adopted the practice," of memorization he means, and not writing things down, "for two reasons. That they do not wish their system of learning to be divulged to the common masses, nor do they want those who learn the rule to rely on writing and so neglect the cultivation of memory. And in fact, it usually does happen that the assistance of writing tends to relax the diligence of the student and the action of the memory." And Caesar surely has in mind Plato's great dialogue, the Phaedrus, where Plato discusses this problem. Going on here, "The cardinal doctrine which they seek to teach is that souls do not die, but after death pass from one person to another." So they're teaching the transmigration of souls, kind of like Pythagoras. Other ancient authors, by the way, attest that this was indeed an important doctrine of the Druids. And this belief they hold to be the greatest incentive to valor, since it causes men to put aside the fear of death. So contrary, to what some people might be expecting, the Gauls, at any rate, they're not dreaming of Valhalla as they charge into battle. They're, dreaming of being reincarnated. Besides this, they have many discussions as touching the stars and their movement, the size of the universe and of the earth, the order of nature, the strength and the powers of the immortal gods, and hand down their lore to the young men. And just pause here. When he says the order of nature, that's De Rerum Natura, which is the title of Lucretius's poem, which is kind of a novel collocation in Latin. So this is one of the reasons people think that Caesar's reading Lucretius when he's in Gaul. Just a fun footnote there. Caesar reading the great Epicurean poem. Going on here, the other class are the knights. This is the military aristocracy that he's talking about. These, whenever there is need for them, especially when a war breaks out, they all devote themselves to war. And before Caesar's coming, this would happen just about every year, when they would either be making wanton attacks themselves or repelling them, and according to the importance of each of them in birth and resources, so is the number of servants and dependents that he has about him. This is the single form of influence and power known to the Gauls. And now for one of the most fascinating and influential passages of all this section. Quote, "The whole nation of Gauls is greatly devoted to ritual observances, and for that reason those who are smitten with the more grievous maladies and who are engaged in the perils of battle either sacrifice human victims or vow to do so, employing the Druids as ministers for such sacrifices. For they believe that the spirits of the immortal gods cannot be placated unless one human life is given for another. They arrange this kind of sacrifice for the community as well. Some of them use figures of immense size, whose limbs, woven out of twigs, they fill with living men and then set them on fire. And then the men perish in a sheet of flame. This is the famous Wicker Man, or maybe the Burning Man. Apparently the Burning Man organizers deny any inspiration from the Wicker Man. Anyway, they believe that the execution of those who have been caught in the act of theft or robbery or some crime is more pleasing to the immortal gods. But when the supply of such fails, they resort to the execution even of the innocent. You would think, according to typical ancient ritual propriety, that they would want, unblemished victims, the innocent, but, conveniently, the Gallic gods prefer criminals, apparently. So Caesar's going to talk about their gods a little bit. The gods are personal. The Romans can find rough equivalents for Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Minerva among the Gallic gods. I'm going to skip this section. But here's an interesting bit on family, on fathers and sons. Quote, "In the other ordinances of life, the main difference between the Gauls and the rest of mankind is that the men do not allow their own sons to approach them openly, in public he means, until they have grown to an age when they can bear the burden of military service, and they count it as a disgrace for a son who is still in his boyhood to take his place publicly in the presence of his father." End quote. Wow. Sons can't talk to their fathers in public. What an interesting strategy for instilling in your society a sense of the stark difference between a man and a boy, and for motivating youths to want to live up to a certain standard, right? Going on a bit more about the family, quote, "Men have the power of life and death over their wives as over their children." Romans had that too, mind you. But the following here is pretty un-Roman. "And when the father of a house, who is of distinguished birth, has died, his relatives assemble, and if there be anything suspicious about his death, they make inquisition of his wives, as they would of slaves." Perhaps he means torturing them. I don't know, that's what you do with slaves. "And if discovery is made, they put them to death with fire and all manner of excruciating tortures." Wow. Their funerals are magnificent and expensive, speaking proportionally considering the level of civilization of Gaul. They cast into the fire everything, even living creatures, which they believe to have been dear to the departed during life. And but a short time before the present age, only a generation since, slaves and dependents known to have been beloved by their lords used to be burnt with them at the conclusion of the funeral formalities. End quote. Herodotus talks about the Indians doing this. So now you have a better sense of the Gauls. But remember, we're in Germany in the story now, and here's Caesar now on the Germans. Quote, "The Germans differ much from this manner of living. They have no Druids to regulate divine worship, no zeal for sacrifices. They reckon among the gods only those whom they see and by whose offices they are openly assisted, to wit, the sun, the fire god, and the moon. They have not even heard of any of the others. Their whole life is composed of hunting expeditions and military pursuits. From early boyhood they are zealous for toil and hardship." That all checks out. Your basic, primitive, noble savage. The following bit now, I think you wouldn't expect. Quote, "Those who remain longest in chastity win greatest praise among their kindred." He's talking about the men here especially. "Some think that abstinence enables men to grow taller, others that it enhances their strength and muscles. Further, they deem it a most disgraceful thing to have had knowledge of a woman before the 20th year. And yet there is no secrecy about sexual matters, for both sexes bathe in the rivers and wear skins or small cloaks of reindeer hide, leaving a great part of the body bare. Wouldn't that make the whole chastity thing all the more difficult and impressive if you could pull it off? No need to remind you here, this is not how the Romans handled such things, especially for young men. Okay, going on. They have little interest in farming, and the greater part of their food consists of milk, cheese, and meat. And the following part here is very striking and unusual to the classical eye. No man has a definite and marked-off portion of land as his own property. Instead, the magistrates and the chiefs each year assign to tribes and clans that have assembled together as much land and in such place as seems good to them, and compel the tenants after a year to pass on elsewhere. So in other words, at least according to Caesar here, they have no private property. He explains their rationale. Quote, "They adduce many reasons for that practice. They fear that they may be tempted by getting attached to the land to substitute agriculture for their warrior zeal. They also want to avoid their citizens becoming zealous for the acquisition of broad territories, with the result that the more powerful drive the less powerful from their holdings. Furthermore, they want to discourage people building their homes with excessive care, such that they are able to avoid the extremes of cold and heat. The Germans, of course, consider cold resistance to be important in forming character. Moreover, they fear lest the passion for money come to engender factionalism and quarrels. Finally, they believe that thereby they may keep the common people content, when each man sees that his own wealth is equal to that of the most powerful." End quote. And many of Caesar's Roman readers would have been thinking of the Spartans here. As I'm sure Caesar knew, the Spartans didn't believe in walls for their cities, and, they dipped their infants in the Eurotas River, the cold mountain springs. And he mentions here a fact of German life that he brought up in an earlier book, that they like to have the borderlands around their territories completely unoccupied, which they take to be a sign of their own military prestige. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the German warband culture, which will become relevant later in this book. "No shame," he says, "is attached to acts of brigandage committed outside the borders of one's state. In fact, the Germans affirm that this practice exists in order to train the young men and to diminish sloth." Going on. "Now there was a time in the past when the Gauls were superior in valor to the Germans and made aggressive war upon them. And because of the number of their people and the lack of land, they sent colonies across the Rhine. But now," Caesar says, "upon the Gauls, however, the closeness of our province and acquaintance with oversea commodities provides for many items that make their lives more agreeable and luxurious. Little by little they have grown accustomed to defeat, and after being conquered in many battles, they do not even compare themselves in point of valor with the Germans." End quote. So if you were going to come to Caesar and say, "Hey Caesar, why have most of our Roman senators grown soft and corrupt? Why don't they make men like Scipio Africanus or Fabius Maximus or Cincinnatus anymore?" I think Caesar's just given you his answer, which is Sallust's answer too. Luxury tends to soften you. Now there's a section next on the great German forest, the local fauna. Many scholars think that it's a later insertion, which seems plausible. He mentions the reindeer and the elk, which they don't have in the southern Mediterranean. And I'm just going to share with you the last kind of fantastical animal, which is a real animal. It's the late, great aurochs, which was a huge wild cow that went extinct as late as the 1600s in Europe. Quote, "A third species consists of the so-called ure oxen." Urus is the Latin. "In size, these are somewhat smaller than elephants. In appearance, color, and shape, they are as bulls. Great is their strength and great their speed, and they spare neither man nor beast once sighted. These the Germans slay zealously by capturing them in pits. By such work the young men harden themselves, and by this kind of hunting train themselves. And those who have slain the most of them display the horns publicly as proof of this, and thereby win great renown. But even if they are caught very young, the animals cannot be tamed or accustomed to human beings. In bulk, shape, and appearance, their horns are very different from the horns of our own oxen. The natives collect them zealously and encase the edges with silver, and then, at their grandest banquets, they use them as drinking cups. The Aurochs, Aurochs, this was supposed to be a cow about 6 feet tall at the shoulder, so that's maybe a foot or a foot and a half taller than your typical domestic cow. Pretty big animal. So much for the Germans and for their territory. That concludes the ethnographic excursus. And after all this discovering, Caesar decides the Suebi aren't going to come and fight him anytime soon. They've retreated to their forest hideouts. And since the Germans, as he's noted, they don't do farming, he's concerned about supplying his army on a long campaign there. There's nothing to ravage. Plus, he's got a man to catch. So Caesar decides to retreat back across the bridge, tear down about 200 feet of it, the 200 feet contacting the German side of the Rhine. And then he builds a big watchtower on the end of this sort of leftover pier that he's built to keep an eye on them. And he mans a fort there with a little more than a legion's worth of men. And so began the great long history of Roman forts on the Rhine border, which ended up being basically the natural boundary of the Roman Empire for some 5 more centuries. Now then, Caesar turns his energy back to Ambiorix, the rogue Belgian. He sends his legate, Lucius Minucius Basileus, into the Ardennes forest, which is there in the territory of the Belgae in northeast Gaul. Basileus gets some intel that Ambiorix is near, and here's what happens. Quote, "In everything, and especially in warfare, great is the power of fortune. For just as it was by great good luck that Basileus fell upon the chief himself, Ambiorix, actually off his guard and unprepared, in fact, Basileus's arrival was seen by everybody before any rumor or message thereof was brought. So likewise it was a great piece of fortune that when all the military equipment he had about him had been captured, the carriages and horses seized, the chief himself, Ambiorix, should escape death. But this too came to pass because the building being surrounded by forest, as the dwellings of the Gauls usually are, for to avoid the heat they generally seek the neighborhood of woods and rivers, his companions and friends in so confined a place held off the attack of our cavalry for a short time. While they fought, one of his followers set him on a horse, and the woods covered his flight. Thus, both in Ambiorix's exposure to danger and in his escape therefrom, the influence of fortune was great." End quote. So, near miss there, they almost had him. And then for reasons that Caesar admits he doesn't quite understand, Ambiorix doesn't choose to rally all of his forces for a battle, but he just sends out a message to the countryside and instructs all of his allies to go into hiding in the forest and wait for his next orders. And many of them flee into the Ardennes forest. However, quote, "Catuvulcus, the king of half the eburones," remember the eburones are Ambiorix's native tribe, Catuvulcus, who had initially participated in the scheme of Ambiorix, was old and worn, and finding that he could not endure the effort of war or flight, cursed Ambiorix by all his gods for originating these plans, and killed himself by means of a yew tree, of which there is a great plenty in Gaul and Germany. And the Latin text just says that he killed himself with a yew tree. The Loeb translator says he hanged himself from the yew tree, but the landmark translator is probably right when he says Catuvolcus killed himself with the poison from a yew tree. Yew trees are, in fact, quite poisonous if you ingest the needles or the berries. They are a pretty red color and they look kind of appetizing. Careful out there, folks. Well, Caesar gets about hunting Ambiorix, and he sends out more commanders to various regions. Quintus Cicero, Labienus, Gaius Trebonius. And the problem that he runs into is Ambiorix and all of his supporters, mainly the warriors of the eburones now, they've faded into the mist, and they're lurking in wait in little bands, and they're making it a very risky operation for the Romans to spread out into smaller parties and a manhunt because these Romans can get ambushed and killed by these Gauls who know the territory better. And they're not having any luck, but what Caesar decides to do is this. Quote, Caesar sent messengers around to the neighboring states and invited them all to join him in pillaging the eburones in the hope of booty, so that he might hazard the lives of the Gauls among the woods rather than the soldiers of the legions, and at the same time, by surrounding it with a large host, destroy the stock and name of the tribe in requital for its horrid crime. A great number assembled speedily from every side. End quote. So Caesar kind of declares a purge on them, if you've heard of that movie. He's built up enough clout in the region that in an extreme circumstance like this, where the eburones' crimes are manifest, these are the guys that slaughtered a legion and a half under Sabinus, well, Caesar can declare with credible authority a free-for-all on the eburones. Nobody pillaging their lands need fear any reprisal, or they'll have Caesar to contend with. And this seems to work at first. The eburones are getting ravaged and ruined. But then, quote, herein it has been possible to note how great is the power of fortune in war, and how great the chances she brings in her train. And that's Caesar saying, who could have foreseen what would happen next, really? So he goes on, the enemy were scared and scattered, as we have mentioned, and there was no body of Gallic troops that could suggest even the slightest occasion for alarm for the Romans. Across the Rhine, the report reached the Germans that the eburones were being pillaged, nay more, that all were invited to come and plunder. 2,000 horsemen then were collected by the Sugambri, who lived nearest the Rhine, and as we set forth above, had received the Tencteri and Usipetes after their flight. On boats and rafts they crossed the Rhine, 30 miles below the spot where the bridge had been built and a garrison left by Caesar. And coming first to the borders of the eburones, they caught many persons scattered in flight, and captured a great quantity of cattle, of which barbarians are very covetous. So he doesn't seem to have been anticipating that the Germans were going to get in on this purge thing, just the Gauls. And the Germans, of course, once you wind these guys up, it's hard to stop them. And, Caesar, who could have possibly foreseen this? Anyway, going on, lured by the prospect of more spoils, they advanced further. As they were born warriors and bandits, no swamps or forests could slow them down. From prisoners, they inquire in what district Caesar is. They find that he has gone on some distance. They learn that all his army is departed. And then one of their prisoners said, why do you pursue this miserable and slender booty, when you now have the chance of the utmost fortune? In 3 hours you may come to Aduatuca. That's Caesar's main base in Gaul at the moment. In that spot the Roman army has concentrated all its stores. The garrison is so small that it cannot even man the wall, and no one dares to step outside the entrenchments. With this hope offered to them, the Germans left in a secret place the plunder that they had gotten already, and made for Aduatuca, using as a guide the very man by whose information they had learnt the news. End quote. Trusty Quintus Cicero is the guy that Caesar has put in charge of the baggage at Aduatuca. He does have a whole legion there, but the Germans don't know that. Now Caesar has promised Cicero that he will return within 7 days, and He instructs him not to leave the camp or do anything rash until he returns. But on the very seventh day, Cicero has heard reports that Caesar has gone off further than expected, and he starts to think, well, maybe Caesar had to change plans and he's not coming back today. It's perfectly understandable, but we could use some supplies around here. And so he decides that very last day to send out some foragers to the nearby territory. Just, within 3 miles of the camp, really close, no big deal, you'd think. But that happens to be exactly the time when, well, let's let Caesar describe it. Quote, just at this moment, as it chanced, once again fortune here, the German horsemen came on the scene, and immediately at the same speed as had brought them there, they tried to burst into the camp at the main gate. There was a screen of woods on that side, so that they were not seen until just when they had arrived at the camp, so much that the traitors encamped close under the rampart had no chance of escaping. Our troops, not expecting them, were thrown into confusion by the surprise, and the cohort on guard barely withstood the first attack. The enemy poured round the other sides of the camp to see if they could find an entry point. Our troops with difficulty defended the gates. All other chances of entrance were prevented by the nature of the place itself and by the entrenchment. There was confusion throughout the camp, and one sought from another the cause of the uproar. One man declared that the camp was already taken. Another insisted that the barbarians had come victorious from the destruction of the army and the commander-in-chief. Caesar must be dead, one guy is saying. And the majority pictured to themselves new superstitions because of the place, and set before their eyes the disaster of Cotta and Sabinus, who, as they remembered, fell in the same fort. Oh yes, they are ironically camped in the same fort that Sabinus had been camped in before he got massacred. Owing to the universal panic caused by such fears, the barbarians were confirmed in the belief that, as they had heard from the prisoner, there was no garrison inside. They strove to break through, exhorting one another not to let so good a chance slip from their hands. End quote. So they think it's going to be easy picking. But they hadn't bet on who else but our man Publius Sextius Baculus, bravest of the brave. We met him before in Book 2 at the Great Battle of the Nervii, and also in the scuffle in the Alps at the beginning of Book 3. With the garrison there had been left behind, sick, a certain Publius Sextius Baculus, who has been mentioned by us in previous battles. He had now been 5 days without food, and doubtful of his own and the general safety, he came forth from his tent unarmed. He saw that the enemy were threateningly close and that the issue was in the greatest danger. He took arms from the nearest men and stationed himself in the gate. He was followed by all the centurions of the cohort on guard, and together for a short space they bore the brunt of the battle. Sextius fainted after receiving severe wounds. With difficulty he was dragged from hand to hand into safety. In the respite thus given, the rest took courage so far as to venture to their stations in the entrenchments and to afford a semblance of defense. End quote. And eventually, with great difficulty, the Romans managed to fight off the Germans. They do end up sustaining some casualties. And the Germans aren't really in the mood for a siege or anything. They're not morally committed to destroying the Romans like a lot of these Gallic rebels are. They just wanted some quick booty. And when they realized it wasn't going to be easy, they just leave. And they go back across the Rhine. They collect the stuff that they had left in their secret place. And so later in the night, a messenger from Caesar arrives, saying, "Caesar's nearby. Calm down, everyone." Nobody calms down, understandably, until Caesar does actually arrive, which seems to be the next day. Quote, "Upon his return, knowing well the ways things turn out in war, Caesar had but one complaint to make, that some cohorts had been sent out from the camp from outpost and garrison duty. He maintained that no room should have been left for even the slightest mischance, and that fortune had proved her power in the sudden arrival of the enemy. Indeed, and far more so, in that she had turned away the natives almost from the very rampart and gates of the camp. Of all these events, the most remarkable seemed to be that the Germans, who had crossed the Rhine with the definite intention of devastating the territory of Ambiorix, by their descent on the Roman camp, ended up doing Ambiorix the greatest favor." So meanwhile, Caesar sends out the cavalry in all directions and returns to the area to survey the results of his Unleash the Purge campaign upon the eburones. And as reports come in, he remarks, with grim satisfaction, that it has been indeed very successful. All the villages and every building that anyone spotted were burned down. Spoils from everywhere were driven off on the hoof, etc., etc. But what about the success of his manhunt, his grand prize, Ambiorix, the instigator himself? Quote, "And with so large a force of cavalry scattered in every direction, it often came to pass that prisoners, when taken, were gazing about for Ambiorix, whom they had seen just now in flight, and even insisting that he had not quite gone out of sight. The hope of catching the fugitive inspired in the men immense exertion, and the thought that they would win the highest favor with Caesar made their zeal almost more than human. Yet always it seemed that they had failed by a little to win supreme success, while Ambiorix stole away from forest and glade, and hidden by night, made for other districts or territories, with no more escort of horsemen than 4 troopers, to whom alone he dared entrust his life." End quote. And so with winter approaching and the campaign season coming to a close, Caesar calls it in. He sends his troops to winter quarters, heads back to Italy to hold the provincial assizes. The great manhunt has failed for this season. But I think this whole episode has reflected well a great truth. Caesar believed in the incredible power of a single man, whether as a figurehead, a symbol, or as a leader, as an agent, because those two things are related, the symbolic and the agential. The power of such a man is what he believed in to make all the difference in a war. And don't we see that happening so often? In a war or in a company, founder mode versus manager mode, in a state, in an entire country. And if one man can make all the difference, can be worth expending enormous resources to hunt down in a huge war like this, how much more impact can one man proportionally have on a small group of people, in a family, in a local community? I like to keep that one in mind. And speaking of the importance of one man, another blockbuster political event that Caesar doesn't mention in this book is that Marcus Licinius Crassus, together with his dashing and talented young son Publius Crassus, has died this year in a huge military disaster in Mesopotamia fighting the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae. That whittles the former triumvirate down to 2 men. And on top of that, Pompey has decided firmly, finally, not to renew his marriage alliance with Caesar, but instead to marry the widow of young Publius Crassus, funny enough, the daughter of Metellus Scipio, who was a corrupt aristocrat that was definitely not in Caesar's camp. So all of Caesar's successes apparently weren't enough to woo Pompey as an ally again. Or maybe it was precisely because of Caesar's successes that Pompey was starting to feel threatened. And suddenly the stars are aligning to make Pompey and Caesar the figureheads and symbols of 2 perpetually opposing parties at Rome, the Optimates with Pompey and the Populares with Caesar. More on that in the other lives that we've already done, such as Pompey's, or those that we'll be covering soon, Cato, Caesar. But anyway, long before the great catastrophe to the Republic, Caesar would get to see his belief in the power of the individual confirmed all too painfully in the following year in the Great Revolt against an enemy unlike any Gaul he had faced so far, Vercingetorix of the Arverni. That's a story for next time. If you enjoyed this, sign up for our email list at costofglory.com. I've got some cool announcements upcoming and some giveaways to share with you. You can also leave us a review or tell a friend, or just take the time to remember the people in your life and the context for which you are that symbol, that agent, or perhaps for which you should be. Stay strong, stay ancient. This is Alex Petkus. Until next time.